Hey guys. Oh wow, a clap before I start. Okay. Thank you. Wow, standing. Oh wow. Cool. Well, thank you guys for staying here. I know it was a long day today, but today, yeah, she already mentioned it. I'm going to just start by talking a little bit about where I come from or who I'm working with. So I come from the nonprofit Center for Resource Solutions. We've been around for over 25 years with the mission to create policy and market solutions to advance sustainable energy. So what that looks like is we have a few different work streams. We work on advisory services, basically consulting type projects as aligns with our expertise and our mission. We also work on renewable energy and climate policy. We're not a lobbying organization, but we give expert advice on REC accounting issues and carbon accounting issues, and especially how the voluntary and compliance markets can work together, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. We also host our own annual conferences called the Renewable Energy Markets Conference. So if I wet your whistle today and you really want to nerd out more about renewable energy, please check it out. We have our REM Asia Conference, which will be in Singapore in April next year, as well as REM US, which will be in Washington, D.C. this year in the first week of September. We're also mostly very well known for being administrators of the Greenie certification program, which provides oversight of the voluntary markets for renewable electricity, carbon offsets, and most newly renewable fuels. And I'll touch about that more in a moment. One of our newer programs is our Clean Energy Accounting Project, or CAP for short. This program was designed to tackle tricky clean energy accounting issues and create some consensus-based best practices. The papers on the right are all available on our website and more for free, so please check them out. But as an example, the first paper we published with the help of Target was about how to account for standard delivered renewable energy. So if you get X amount of renewables from the grid already, how can you count that as part of your renewable energy goal? One of the newer papers that's been pretty popular is our market-based accounting for clean fuels. Right now, there's a bit of a gray area on how to do carbon accounting for clean fuels, especially while the greenhouse gas protocols looking at their scope 2 and planning to deal with that later, a few years down the road. But we wanted to create somewhat of an interim guidance so that folks can go ahead and hit the ground running and start taking action now while we're waiting for those final rules. Looking to next year, we have some exciting topics coming up, and there's ways for organizations like yourselves to get involved. We have an advisory committee that actually helps us decide what projects we're working on. Participants include Apple, AT&T, Google, Constellation, and others. So that's really important to help us do this work. And we also have working group sponsors that actually sit on the working groups and help us develop these materials. So next year, we're going to be working on accounting for utility scale clean energy storage, global data and market conditions for standard delivered clean energy. That's a follow-up from that first paper I mentioned about standard delivered renewables, but more on a global scale. Also, credible cross-market energy attribute certificate transactions. So if you have more of a global, and we've been talking a lot about supply chain, how do you credibly trade attributes cross markets? And finally, credible clean energy attribution in the corporate value chain. Again, another one focused on scope 3, which we talked about a lot today, of your value chain. How can you help your value chain and potentially allocate renewables to them? So if any of those are interesting to you, please talk to me, and we can talk about these at my networking table as well, but you could get involved if interested. Circling back now to Greenie, as I promised. So Greenie is a leading third-party certification for these voluntary environmental commodities to help make sure they're coming from, sustainable and positive projects, and also provide oversight to make sure customers are protected and getting what they expect. So Greenie Energy is definitely our largest program, and what I'll focus on today that certifies voluntary renewable electricity and RECs. We also have a program to certify voluntary carbon offsets. As I mentioned, our newest program is for renewable fuels. Currently, we certify voluntary biomethane, also called renewable natural gas. We're currently working to expand this into green hydrogen as well, and plan to tackle other fuels in the future too. And then our marketplace program is more for validating marketing claims related to renewable electricity usage. So as I mentioned, focusing today on the renewable electricity piece. So for Greenie Energy being our largest program, we're really excited that we certified over 143 million megawatt hours in 2024. So as you can see by this very tiny graph, that you've really seen the growth of our Greenie Energy program. So that's really showing both the voluntary renewable energy market growing along with our program, thanks to a lot of organizations that you work for as well participating in that market. And through Greenie Energy, we're really, first of all, making sure that the supply is coming from newer resources. So all generators have to be less than 15 years old, create that demand signal, encourage new renewables. We also want to make sure they're from sustainable resources. So certain things are disqualified, like legacy hydro for the concerns of impounding water, or some restrictions on biomass as well. And then finally, like I mentioned, oversight of the actual sellers of these environmental commodities to make sure that you're getting exactly what was promised to you. And this is talking a little, because of those different benefits, Greenie cited and endorsed in a lot of sustainability best practices. So some in the room, we heard LEED talk yesterday from the U.S. Green Buildings Council. So one way to get points through that is procuring Greenie certified supply. I know Meet Green is in the room, so I recall they have Greenie recommended there as well. So essentially, lots of folks pointing to the benefits that Greenie can allow to basically give you peace of mind in your renewable energy procurements. So taking a step back here of looking at the voluntary renewable energy market. So when you think of the renewable energy market, it's usually comprised of both the compliance market, so basically states setting goals or require regulations saying that we have to be X% renewable by a certain date. That is usually part of what's called a renewable portfolio standard, or RPS. And then you have the voluntary market, which is, organization like yours saying, this is important to us. We want to support clean energy and voluntarily procuring renewables. And we see these working in tandem to both push the voluntary or the renewable energy market forward. So on the graph on the left, you see from the National Renewable Energy Laboratories that, over time and up to 2023 is a time scale here, that you've seen generation increasing on both markets. But it's interesting to note that the voluntary market is growing quicker, so really closing that gap and showing the impact of the voluntary market. On the right is a graph from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I want to draw your attention to the red line there, which is showing decreasing over time, because that's actually representing the percentage of renewable capacity additions up to the timescale 2024 resulting from RPS, so renewable portfolio standards and compliance markets. So you can see that's reducing over time, indicating that the voluntary market's actually having more and more of an impact. So that's really exciting and great work for your organizations who are participating. Luckily, Alex from WRI already kind of gave you a little bit of a disclaimer about what RECs are, and I think a lot of people already know, but just to make sure to bring everyone along if maybe you're focused on recycling or other things. Renewable energy certificates, or RECs, are the environmental commodity that represents the renewable attribute of 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy generation. And RECs are needed for a few reasons. Firstly, to allocate and claim use of renewable energy on a shared grid. So in this little pictograph, all those little electrons on a shared grid, it's hard to say who is having that renewable electron if you're on a shared grid. So it's a way to allocate that claim, and it's used for both the voluntary and the regulatory market, so they're speaking the same language. It also helps avoid double counting and double claiming, as well as create a national market for buying renewable energy, although that might change if rules change and geographies get smaller, but we can talk about that at my table as well. And many are familiar with the different ways to implement renewable energy procurement, which was talked about earlier as well. So everything from self-generation, I think is the most obvious, of solar on your roof, to direct purchasing, where you're purchasing directly from a generator you don't own. This has become a more and more popular option as buyers want to increase their impact and really have their funds go directly to developers. We learned about aggregated PPAs, so similar thing like that. And then finally, retail purchasing. So that would be participating in utilities' green tariff or utility green pricing program, or your competitive supplier, as well as just unbundled RECs. Regardless, in all these situations, you really need to retain the REC to be able to make the environmental claim, because that's, again, the piece that's really showing the environmental claim. So getting to kind of the theme of my talk here, some tips to ensure you're getting the full benefit of your renewable energy purchase. So usually if you're procuring voluntary renewables, you're doing it because you want to have impact, you want to reduce your carbon emissions, and you need to think of a few things if you want to do so. I'm going to review things such as avoiding double claims, avoid double counting with state requirements, making sure the greenhouse gas reduction benefits are included, and then letting your stakeholders know about your procurement. Oop. So firstly, avoiding double claims. So in this, I use an example here of you have the school that has a solar carport, and they're really excited about it, and they want to make the claim, our solar canopy will produce enough energy to power 30% of our school with renewable energy. However, they might have discovered that the developer they worked with actually retained the REC and sold it off to the state renewable portfolio standard requirement, and therefore that school doesn't actually have the REC. So this can be good because it facilitated their project being less expensive, and that's probably why the developer did that. However, it's important for the school to know they no longer can make that claim, because if they were to, then there'd be a double claim issue with whoever actually got that REC. And so at Greenie, we try to help with that issue because we actually do a claims review before any generation can be used in a Greenie certified product to make sure there's no outstanding claim issue if it's being sold to someone else. And really, of course, avoiding double claims is important to keep the integrity of the market and really help the mechanisms have the signals that we're looking for. Another issue that gets a little wonky, but I think is pretty interesting, is avoid double counting with state requirements. So many states, we're a patchwork of states with there are many different requirements, as we've heard about today through compliance issues. So they all have their own way of tracking renewables and own goals. And so there's some unique state requirements that may already count renewables as being used by all residents and then not really facilitating that voluntary market piece. We had an example of this recently, and actually I think the bill was in 2021, HB 2021, but in Oregon, the impact in 2024 that the Oregon Clean Energy Targets bill led to double claiming issues. And actually this is a bit of a typo, I learned more of a nuance since I wrote this, but essentially the generation in Oregon was disqualified for Greenie because there was a chance that it's being reported to the Oregon DEQ for compliance. And this issue came up because basically for this compliance, the state didn't actually require RECs to be retired for the compliance. And so that led to clear, potential double claim issues of it going to a state compliance program as well as potentially being sold off for more to a voluntary customer. And so because of this, some of our Oregon participants had to or decided to leave the program because there was that regulatory surplus issue is what we call it in Greenie. Because we're always looking for that regulatory surplus, because as a voluntary customer, you're taking voluntary actions, sometimes paying more for it. You want to push the needle above and beyond business as usual and not just subsidize some state or some utility to get to a goal that they're required to otherwise. Because in a sense, you'd be paying more than once for something because you're already paying the utility to meet required goals, and then to help them additionally doesn't quite make sense. So that's a key component of Greenie to make sure that your purchase is actually pushing in the needle above and beyond business as usual. And that's why we keep track of all the wonky policy decisions that you might not be aware of. And that's a key component too, where we've seen, as I mentioned, more procurement directly from generators. And we've actually have a program called Greenie Direct where we certify PPAs and direct procurements. And we're seeing that grow. And I think a big reason for that is exactly this, the regulatory surplus. A lot of the buyers might not know all those interactions that we keep track of, and we'll also inform them if things change if they're not still getting that regulatory surplus that we require. Number 3, make sure the greenhouse gas reduction benefits are included. This is also kind of wonky, but I think very interesting. Usually you're procuring voluntary renewables because you want to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. And that can have a challenge in cap and trade markets, such as in California, Washington, and the RGGI states in the Northeast, where they have a cap and trade carbon program. So what occurs in these markets is, like on the left, you have a cap that's capping carbon emissions. If you were to procure voluntary renewables, technically there's less carbon emissions, so there's less carbon underneath the cap. However, if you don't do anything or let the state know, technically someone else could just pollute more under that cap because the cap is not moving. So CRS, as well as many other stakeholders, have often established in these markets what's called a voluntary set-aside allowance, where the state sets aside a certain amount of carbon allowances for voluntary procurement so that the voluntary procurers or the sellers can notify the state, hey, someone source voluntary renewables, and they can retire one of those voluntary set-aside allowance, which the ultimate effect is lowering the overall carbon cap. So then you're actually having greenhouse gas reduction emissions overall by procuring voluntary renewables, where if you don't take that extra step or didn't know to do so, technically, again, you're not really having an impact on overall carbon emissions. And again, that's something that we require for any voluntary renewables in those types of markets. So when you get greenie, you know you don't really need to worry about that because we're ensuring that that's occurring on your behalf. And then final piece is to let your stakeholders know about your procurement. So as I mentioned, we have the Greenie Marketplace program where we verify marketing claims related to renewable electricity usage. So you'll see the little Greenie logo and Arm & Hammer baking soda saying this product's made with 100% renewable electricity. So this really comes from the consumer push. I found some research about 78% of Americans wanting to buy from environmentally friendly companies. 79% of Gen Z and millennials use labels and third-party certificates to see if they can trust that type of claim. What I'm hearing more and more lately is some green hushing, which I understand. I do think, though, there's still an opportunity here, especially in certain business, business types and certain demographics you might be hitting, because guilty as a millennial, I will fall for this. But the other piece that we've really seen growing in this space, and we're hearing about a lot today, is more the B2B side of things. Businesses want to green their supply chain, and something like this can really help differentiate you. So, 49% of companies are buying from their more sustainable suppliers. And I think, something like saying you're already sourcing voluntary renewables and that's been verified can really help make the case, as then they know that their scope 3 are lower as well as a result. Oh, and I just added too that Microsoft, is really pushing the suppliers to cut emissions and adopt clean energy. And that's just one example of many companies looking to do this as well. And especially if you're supporting voluntary renewables, we know it's the right thing to do. As we talked about, sometimes to talk to certain parts of your organization, making that business case can really help sustain that type of commitments. And finally, if you're just starting, just pointing to our website where you can find all the Greenie certified options at green-e.org/buy. But really also just looking for that when you source voluntary renewables, just asking your suppliers for them to be Greenie certified. Not surprising to anyone, most people aren't like, please audit us. They do it because their buyers value it. So be sure to look for that and just look for all those pitfalls I mentioned earlier when doing voluntary renewables. So that was a lot in 15 minutes. So feel free to come to my table if you want to just nerd out about voluntary renewables, or I'd love to hear what you're working on as well. And thanks for your time.